Welcome to the Carnivore Cast, the podcast focused on the carnivore diet and lifestyle, with practical advice from successful carnivores, citizen scientists, and top researchers. I'm your host, Scott Meslinski, and I'm here to speak with experts and experienced carnivores to get answers to your biggest and meatiest questions while helping you live your best life as a carnivore. If you enjoy the show, please consider supporting the Carnivore Cast on Patreon. By becoming a patron, you'll help us reach more people and continue to create content on Carnivore. There are also exclusive perks available, such as private Q&As, consultations with me, and more. Become a supporter at patreon.com/carnivorecast. Check the episode description for the link. Thank you, and I'll see you there. Carnivore Kurt Josue, returns to the Carnivore Cast today. If you missed part 1 with Kurt, please go check that out. He talked about healing his gut and anxiety issues with carnivore and working with and learning from Dr. Paul Saladino. Kurt is a carnivore diet expert who healed himself with the carnivore diet after years of anxiety and gut issues as an entrepreneur. He shares phenomenally helpful professional and informational videos on his YouTube channel. You can search Carnivore Kurt, and those include how to implement a nose-to-tail carnivore diet, along with things like optimizing sleep and light and living the best quality of life you can. Kurt has a new book coming out, which I'm very excited to chat with him about today. Welcome to the show, Kurt.
Thanks for having me, Scott.
Of course. So how have you been? How are things?
Man, things are great. Lots of things have happened, all good things. Man, I don't even know where to begin. I actually, do you know Kyle Kingsbury?
Yeah. I'm a huge fan. I was actually re-listening to his episode with Paul, this morning.
Cool. So I actually did a ceremony with him last weekend, and it was a life-changing experience. I won't go into detail because I know a lot of people here probably want to hear more about the carnivore diet, but I've been focusing on getting that side of my life very dialed in. And so I actually incorporated a company purely for that kind of mission, and I called it Optimal Alignment. And so that is the new company. We brought over a couple of people that we had on my existing company, Crush for Ties, and our book is scheduled to launch on Monday, and it's called The Carnivore Diet, an Ancestral Reset to Optimal Human Health. I'm super stoked for that because I think it's going to help a lot of people who are in this space.
That's very cool. Well, let's get into it. Tell me a little bit more about the book. You know, what compelled you to say, I need to write a book about this. I need to put a resource together.
So probably like a lot of people who come to the carnivore community, I had a lot of anxiety around the whole diet. I was really kind of scratching my head going into ketogenic diets because of the whole lipid hypothesis and how there was all this sort of concern around high cholesterol and saturated fat and what it does for cardiovascular health. My family has heart disease, and I've lost 3 uncles, 2 of which to heart disease. My grandfather on my dad's side passed away before he even turned 50 from a heart attack. And so it was very much based on all the influence I had growing up, and even from my family, a pretty big concern for me. And so part of getting into the carnivore diet, which I'm super grateful for knowing a lot of people like you and the sisters and Paul Saladino, and being able to kind of lean on them for a lot of information and further insight, was answering these questions for myself. And so I started kind of posting and creating content around the concepts, but I really just needed to do a really deep dive. And so the book was me going in and just thinking about all the reasons why the carnivore diet works and why it may not be this terrible thing that I kind of had these preconceived notions around. And so that was kind of the impetus to start it. And then I've been in an affiliate marketing business for the last 6 years, and it's been a very successful business financially, but it hasn't brought me a tremendous amount of sort of deep fulfillment in a mission that as nearly as impactful and meaningful as the carnivore movement has. And so I have had this vision of almost creating a company kind of like On It Nutrition, but in my own way that is more of a nutrition or optimal alignment business. And so I formed this company called OptiAlign. And now our mission is basically, I'm writing my second book, actually, Scott, already on sleep, and that's almost done. It's much shorter. So this book is actually about 140 pages, the carnivore diet book I wrote. And I'm working with a coach who is a speaker and author of about 8 books. She's sold over 120,000 copies of books online. So our book is going to be published. It's not going to be published on Amazon at first. We're going to launch it through a funnel on a website on carnivorecast.com. And then we have some different things that we're going to sell alongside it to kind of see if we can build a business model out of this while offering my sort of research into it. And I can dive into the sections and talk more about the specifics of it, but that's kind of the high level of the story.
Yeah, that's really cool. And an awesome story. It's really inspiring to me because, I am almost regretting saying this out loud, but for the longest time, my wife, girlfriend at the time, was like, you should start a podcast. You should start a podcast. And I kept saying, no, there's so many great podcasts out there that have all the guests on them that I love. And now her whole thing is you should write a book. and my answer is pretty much the same. So I'm running out of excuses, but, yeah, tell us a little more about the book, and what some of the sections will be like, and who it's really for.
Totally. So I've read Dr. Baker's book, and I'm reading the Carnivore Code, which I saw you post that you had finished, which is impressive because it's quite an in-depth read with a lot of information in there.
It's a page turner, though. I really like his style of writing. I thought it was very it grips you.
Absolutely. And Paul's an incredible writer. Like I remember he was in my apartment here sitting down with his father on the phone hours upon hours last year at, I think it was KetoCon. No, not KetoCon, but when we were doing our hunting trip, he came in a few days early to kind of hang out with me and Kyle. And, it was just like he was grinding so hard to just go through all these chapters and just work through it. So it's really been a labor, I know, for him, and it's been a beautiful work. My book is going to be a little bit, it's not going to be nearly as technical. I just don't have the background, the biochemistry and understanding that Paul does. So for me, a big section of my book is just my story. And it's my story of being an entrepreneur, someone coming from the corporate world, experiencing anxiety, which became a disorder, having a panic attack, having to sort of regain my emotional and physical health through the misinformation and then learning about the information and then going on the carnivore diet. And there's parts of the story and some pictures of me and Paul in there. So I talk about how I met him and how we were both kind of pre-carnivore and then we went carnivore. And then I spent time going into epidemiology, the biochemistry, like, do you really get all the vitamins from the carnivore diet? Do you not? I try to break it down from my perspective, which is someone who has an associate's degree in biology and an engineering degree as a bachelor's, but certainly doesn't have the level of biochemistry of a physician assistant or a doctor. And then I went into like the toxicity stuff like TMAO, which was some of the things I heard from Mercola and Gundry years ago from like the plant paradox and their concerns around that, mTOR, cancer with red meat. I talked and I went into depth and shared a lot of my own stuff with my labs. Like I've pulled my labs now 3 times in the diet.
Very cool.
I've gone into depth on my YouTube channel, so people can go to the Carnivore Cast YouTube and check that out if they want to see like just a really good walkthrough. But in the book, I break down kidney function, my renals, my lipids, my inflammation markers. And I just talk about like, okay, if the carnivore diet was harmful, why are these the numbers that we're seeing? And then I go into some of the work from like Dr. Anthony Gustin, who has Perfect Keto and has blogged a lot about ketogenic diets and high fat diets. And then I talk about the vegan dilemma, which for me is this, idea that, going vegan feels like it's a better thing for most people and it makes them feel lighter and like they're doing something better for the planet. And I break down a lot of that. Then I go into some ancestral stuff. I dig into a bit of like hormones for both male and female. I tried to answer some of the questions and look at some of the studies around if the carnivore diet would be a good thing for women who are pregnant or breastfeeding. And then there's a huge section, Scott, that I don't think anyone has ever written about in the carnivore diet that was really powerful for me. And this was the idea that I spend quite a bit of time talking about the mindset and the mindset of food being a fuel for you, and this mindset that you kind of need to understand why you're emotionally eating if that's something you do as a habit. And I have this in my family. I'm sure a lot of people emotionally eat, but the idea is that sometimes we eat to protect ourselves, and it's not just like the biochemistry of food tasting good or making us feel good, but it could be another mechanism there. So for example, in my book, I talk about how when I was, this is about 10 years ago, I dabbled a bit in hypnotherapy, and I was actually thinking about doing like a little bit of a side comedy hypnotist type show where I would go to like high schools or different parties and just put on little hypnosis acts. And in hypnosis, one of the things they talk about when they're training you, because I went through a course, 2 of them actually, and my instructor was talking about how the subconscious mind can create defense mechanisms to protect you that aren't necessarily physically good for you. And one of the things is emotional eating, because in a lot of cases, people feel pain in a relationship or an experience they had. And for example, if a woman was abused, she might have been in a marriage or relationship where she was abused. And one of the mechanisms you see with emotional eating with women is they gain weight and they become less attractive. And then it prevents them from getting into another relationship, because that mechanism is something their unconscious mind has developed to keep them safe, even though it's on the surface probably hurting them. So I go quite a bit into that, which I guess it's a little bit of a deviation, but I think it's really important for a lot of people who want to make a major shift. If they're going to change their entire diet and get rid of plant molecules, I think one, you have to really understand and have some grounding that there's not to be fear here, and that you're not going to miss out on key things you need in your body, which I spend time breaking down. And then you're not going to hurt yourself with toxicity that we've been led to believe from saturated fat and these high lipids and all of that. And then I really dive into the emotional aspect and kind of understanding I use the triune brain model. I don't know if you've ever seen that, Scott. I think you have, right? We talked briefly about that. So the triune brain model is this idea that humans evolved with 3 brains. We have our cerebellum, neocortex kind of human brain at the top that does our cognitive analytical functioning. And then below that, we have our limbic system, which is our mammalian brain, which really functions at the emotional level with mammalian function. And then we have our amygdala and our brainstem, which is our reptilian instinctual brain. And the theory with the triune brain that Dr. Paul MacLean sort of coined is this idea that over the millions of years that we evolved as a species, the brains, each of those brains were different brains. And we first had our reptilian brain, then we developed our mammalian brain, and then we developed our cognitive human brain. And they don't always talk well to each other, and they have certain functions and roles. So classic example, fight or flight, freeze, the instinctual sympathetic nervous system response is built more into our instinctual reptilian brain at the primal level. And that brain will give us sensations in our body, which our limbic brain, which sits on top of that, our mammalian limbic brain, will then interpret. And it could be a very subtle difference between the sensations of excitement, for example, and anxiety. But we then look at it and we kind of label it and interpret those sensations coming from the reptilian brain into our mammalian limbic brain. And then our cognitive brain puts a verbal label on it. It says, oh, that's anxiety, or, oh, that is excitement. And it's very subtle, but it's very different. But the main thing that I break down in the book is I want people to understand that this is part of us, and it's something we have built into us. It's a very old system. And when you understand that, it can help you better understand, why are you eating this way? Maybe you need to work through this or better understand what's kind of leading you down this path and preventing you from taking that step to regain your control of your health and the way you want to eat. So that kind of covers the first half of the book. And then the second half of the book, I have an adaptation plan and a progression of the eating. And I basically break it down. And I looked back at like how I kind of transitioned to the carnivore diet and got rid of a lot of the booby traps and mistakes I made. And I know we talked about like the rendered fats and the quality of the meats and just, avoiding some of those booby traps with carnivore. But what I did in this section of the book was I really just give people a plan. I'm like, okay, if you want to do carnivore, here's what you're going to do. You're going to eat up the plant foods and the foods that aren't carnivore until they're gone. You're not going to go buy them. And then you're going to start adding in each day of the week a full on carnivore meal. Once you add a full carnivore meal in a single day, you'll do that for a week or two, and then you'll add in a full day of carnivore. And it's sort of a progression model. And I give people the option to just jump full into the deep end of the pool if they want, but they can do the progression, because I think just for a lot of people, because of where they're at with their body and because of the habit they have to build and food they just don't want to maybe waste and all the things that go into making such a drastic change, if they're coming from a diet that's more standard American or just has a lot of plants in it, they need a tool. And so I break that down in here. And then I talk about nose to tail. I talk about ways to cook, because I think there's a big nuance for a lot of people. Again, that comes back to the whole gut issue thing. There's a lot of people who, when they go carnivore, they don't realize that the rendered fats and the liquefied oils and things like that can just go through their small intestine to the large intestine and trigger loose stool and cause bloating and some indigestion there. And there's a lot of things you can learn to sort of go back on that. I spend time talking about the kidney health. Like I mentioned earlier, I pull out my labs. I show my renal function. I show my lipids in detail. I go into histamines and allergies, because it was something I dealt with. And it's something actually I see in a lot of people. And histamine is something, there's a lot of foods that are high histamine that are outside of the carnivore diet, which makes the carnivore diet very helpful for people who are dealing with histamine intolerance. But there's also quite a bit of foods in the carnivore diet that can be high histamine, like sometimes jerky or smoked salmon or slow cooked, even bone broth. Some of these foods, because of the way you're preparing them, they can build up high levels of histamine. And if you're eating those, you can develop a histamine intolerance, and then you can have like an allergic sort of symptomatic experience that can be prolonged. And you may just think you're doing carnivore and why am I feeling this way? And it's because of the nuance of how the food and the meat is and how it's being prepared. So I go into that. I dig into the fiber and the gut health aspect of things, like why we don't need fiber. There's definitely studies in there that I dug into and reference, so people can go in and look at that, interventional trials and things like that. For me, I dedicated the book to my grandmother, who had schizophrenia, and she's actually from Massachusetts. She went to McLean, which is that mental hospital, one of the most famous mental hospitals in the world. And Chris Palmer was on the Fundamental Health podcast, and I talk about how Chris Palmer has been using ketogenic diets to help treat mental health. And I look at the benefits of some of the nutrients in the carnivore diet in these animal foods that is helping with mental health, and how perhaps mental health is much more closely related to our insulin resistance. And, people are calling like Alzheimer's the type 3 diabetes of today. And so I dive into the mental health and how I experienced that in my family growing up, with my grandmother having schizophrenia diagnosed at 33, and how that completely changed our life, and how I think it's really important for people to be very careful with their diet, and how important it is to do something like this for their long-term health. Because if we lose our minds, we really just don't have anything. We're kind of lost. And so I talk about that. I talk about vitamin C. I briefly touch on coffee and tea, because I think that, as we've discussed, some people can have issues with coffee. Side note, Scott, I went through my genetics, with Coach Tara Garrison. I don't know if you know who she is.
Yeah.
And we did a pure genomics review, and I'm actually a normal metabolizer of caffeine. So,
lucky.
that was kind of interesting. Yeah. And And then I talk about weight loss. I talk about the hormone aspect of weight loss, how I think it's more of, yes, you need to eat at a deficit, but the big thing is insulin, hyperinsulinemia, lowering your insulin levels so you can actually tell your fat cells to release the fat stores and operate on ketosis and burn the fat reserves in your body. When you're constantly eating foods that are all triggering your pancreas and your body to produce insulin, you cannot lose fat on your body. It just doesn't signal to your body to do that. And so if you want to lose weight, you have to go into this aspect of your hormones and you have to dial in your hormones. And then I briefly sprinkle in some information about inflammation and autoimmune. And I address some of the common facts, and I give people some of my best stuff in like a page or two on sleep, light exposure, environmental hermetics. And that's kind of like a full breakdown of
Wow.
kind of how the book goes.
That sounds amazing. I can't wait to get my hands on it, Kurt, and dive into some of these things. I love how you start with the framing of that. What was it called? The brain system?
The triune brain model.
The triune brain model. That sounds really fascinating. And one of the things I love about Mark Bell's podcast and him and Chris Bell is they talk a lot about this mental relationship with food and how a lot of food habits can come from how you were raised and a lot of the things you're talking about around emotional suppression and, different people using fat almost as a defense tool. I haven't personally struggled with that, but it makes so much sense. And I think people's relationship with their food can be so complex in so many ways. And I think that's one of the biggest things about the carnivore diet is improving your relationship with food. I'm sure you get the question all the time. And I love how, Paul Saladino always calls it out as one of his FAQs. How often can I have cheat meals? What's a good cheat meal? and I mean, it's funny, but it's also like, it's very telling. Like my first reaction to that was like, no, you can't have cheat meals. Then my second reaction was like, I wonder why all these people are asking this. And I think it really is like, it takes a vast transformation in your mental health, to get to the point where you feel like you don't need that.
Yeah. And I don't know if we talked about this in the last podcast, but I've been on a few other ones. And one thing that I've been thinking a lot about is like, I do think we need variety as a species.
Yes.
Like, I think it's something in our DNA. Like, we want variety, but
yeah, we talked about this in your motorcycle.
Way? Yeah. There you go. So
that's awesome.
Yeah. So I definitely think it's that way. And the carnivore diet has plenty of variety. You can mix it up. People like the Strong Sisters have done great work with their cookbook and their org encyclopedia.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so there's ways to do it. It takes some work, but man, diet is such a big lever that messing with it too much is usually it's not worth it. It's one of those that you just, to me, it's hard. I struggle with sleep. Like sleep, I know I feel so much better if I get to bed at 9. It's just such a restrictive thing. And, I've been thinking a lot more about that, especially now that I'm writing this second book on sleep. And it's like, how do we do sleep, but still, how do we do it in a way we're not creating anxiety to get to bed on time and in a way where it doesn't like affect our quality of life, but we could still do it and really honor it. And I don't know the right answer to that, but I think it's kind of a moving target where I think you probably have to sort of weigh the pros and cons, because as a society, we're so built in with the 9 to 5 in how people make a living and how they live that it's probably going to be next to impossible to change that. And I have experimented. I think I told you I did a experiment last August. The entire month of August, I stayed up till 4 a.m. every night, and I had my apartment blacked out, and I would wake up at noon. So I slept from 4 to noon, 8-hour block, and I felt miserable, and my hormones were not that good. I could not hack it, is what I'm trying to say. Even though I tried to do everything I could. It's like I went outside and the sun was not out when I was up for a good 4 or 5 hours of the day. But what was interesting was like, it was very easy for me to go, let's go do something at night, and it was like, I had all this freedom, but, Yeah, it's interesting, but the mind thing is very intriguing. There's a specific section in the book, Scott, you'll probably enjoy, where there was a railroad worker named Phineas Gage, and he was a foreman, I believe, in Pennsylvania.
Oh yeah,
and
they cover this in every psych class.
rod.
It's super interesting.
He had a rod that got shot through his skull and knocked out I think it's his left cerebrum. Like it literally took out a huge chunk of his brain. And the guy lived for 9 or 10 years later, or maybe it was even 12. And I go and talk about it because I'm explaining the triune brain model, and I'm saying this brain on the top of us, this analytical brain, is not the core driver of what keeps us alive. And that core driver is so much more powerful. And we're not even consciously aware of it. But if we can start to sort of understand it and get some knowledge around it, it's sort of like taming a dragon. You want to try to, not that I would know how to tame a dragon or, be able to give people qualified advice for that. But it's the older I've gotten and the more experience I've gotten in business, the more I realize that we are a lot less in control of ourselves than we think we are. And so it's seemed to me to be very good wisdom to create space and respect ourselves and try to just remove the noise around us so we can get clear on who we are and get a better connection to that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's very well said. And my advice for making it work socially is pushing for lunch dates. And, one thing me and my wife have done recently is we'll go on walking dates with people.
That's awesome.
So go with another couple and just walk around Boston, walk around nature, walk down to the river. It's really nice actually. But we'll also cook for people. And I think, the variety piece is really interesting. The other thing I was thinking about as you were saying it is of course, another way to find variety in life is through experiences. I think, when we're optimizing so well for diet, you can also be kind of not necessarily 80-20, but closer to 80-20 with some of your other habits. Maybe you say, one night every 2 weeks, I'm going to have a less than great night of sleep and I'm going to go out to a comedy show or a concert, or, I know that cooking grass-fed, grass-finished meat in my home that's well sourced is always the best option. But, every once in a while I'm going to go out to a steakhouse or go out to a barbecue place, or, find ways to make the diet exciting and make specifically being a carnivore exciting, to find those sources of variety. So you're not sitting at home alone eating your, grass-fed finished suet and, ethically sourced steaks, every single meal.
And counting the minutes before you have to get into bed, so you get in bed at the right time.
Exactly. There's a balance. And I think what you do most of the time is what, determines your health, your success, your happiness, everything. So it's just making sure that those types of things are the exception.
I agree.
Cool. Well, Kurt, what else can people do to find out more about the book, find out more about you? I'm super excited to dive into it, but, when can they find it? Where can they find it? And more of that.
So the book is coming out March 16th, which is Monday. We're doing this on the 10th, Tuesday, so I'm not sure when this will drop, but it's going to be out the Monday, March 16th. So maybe out by the time people listen to this. I'm sure most people will probably be able to go there. They can go to carnivorecast.com/upcoming right now. And we have an email that they can basically enter in their information, and we'll let them know as soon as the book drops. And then we also have a roadmap. We call it the Foolproof Carnivore Diet Roadmap. And it breaks down what water is probably the best versus the worst type of water to get, what type of, fat sources, from raw beef trimmings to suet to ghee to, or more rendered tallow. And I try to give them a sort of a one-sheeter there so they can go there and get that. As you know, we have the Carnivore Kurt YouTube channel, and we're getting a lot more active on our Carnivore Kurt Instagram. So I would say anywhere, Carnivore Kurt, if they Google it, they'll find us and they'll absolutely be able to find the book. It'll be easy to find.
Awesome. I'll get all those links from you and share them in the show notes and at carnivorecast.com. And super excited for the book and wishing you all the success with it, Kurt. And thanks again for coming on today.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Scott. I really appreciate it. And yeah, I look forward to sharing it with you and getting your feedback, man. It'd be great.
Yeah.
If you enjoy the show, please consider supporting the Carnivore Cast on Patreon. By becoming a patron, you'll help us reach more people and continue to create content on Carnivore. There are also exclusive perks available, such as private Q&As, consultations with me, and more. Become a supporter at patreon.com/carnivorecast. Check the episode description for the link. Thank you, and I'll see you there. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Carnivore Cast. If you enjoyed this episode, please review on iTunes. It really helps us out. And share it with a friend. What questions would you like answered, or who would you like to hear from in the carnivore research community? You can find me on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at Carnivore Cast, or go to carnivorecast.com. You can also email me at info@carnivorecast.com. I'd love to hear from you. Until next time, keep it carnivore.